Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to my talk. Great to see everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about Amelia Edwards' ghost stories and her dark tourism. So a little bit about me, if you don't know about my research. I'm the co-director of the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies at Manchester Met in the UK. So if you don't know about our Gothic Centre and you are Gothic fans, do look us up, follow us on Facebook, find us on LinkedIn or our website. I'm a specialist in the 19th century, in Victorian Gothic in particular, and I've worked more recently on ghost stories. I've done some editing of women's ghost stories, and my most recent book was called The Haunted House in Women's Ghost Stories, which I'm afraid is horribly expensive, but you might be able to find it in the library if you're looking for it there. And I've also contributed to other collections about Victorian ghost stories, and ghosts and the Gothic. So I've been particularly interested in the woman writer and how she produces ghost stories to address her position within the patriarchal society of the 19th century. But Amelia Edwards doesn't quite fit into some of the paradigms of the ghost story of the haunted house as an uncanny space that I've looked at in previous research. What I'm working on at the moment is a project called Victorian and Edwardian Death Spaces. And this is going to be a book for the Manchester University Press, coming out perhaps in 2027, maybe, if I manage to write it in time. And this is looking at death in a little bit more detail. So it still includes some discussions of the figure of the ghost, but also looks at the spaces of death in the long 19th century, particularly cemeteries, some haunted houses, some museums, and thinking about how that death space becomes sacred or contested, or sort of starts off questions about how women are memorialized is something I'm particularly interested in at the moment. So that idea of the museum itself as a death space, and the practice of tourism in the 19th century are all things that led me to a figure like Amelia Edwards. So these are some of the topics that I'm going to be looking at today. I'm going to start off with this question: who was Amelia Edwards anyway? What do we know about her? I'm going to think about this intersection between ghost stories and travel writing, because I'll be talking about her work in both of those genres. And then I'll look at some examples of different kinds of Gothic. I'm going to think about railway ghost stories, think about Gothic Italy and Egyptian Gothic, which I know you've had a fabulous session on by Jay Sullivan for Romancing the Gothic in previous weeks. And I'll end up thinking about these ideas of tomb raiding as a kind of dark tourism in the 1870s, 1880s. Some of the images in this talk are produced by Amelia herself. She did have skills as an artist as well as a writer. So when she travelled down the Nile in the 1870s, she also did a lot of sketching and painting while she was there. So some of these images are her own, and they're really beautiful. I think you'll agree. So this is one of the broader questions I'm thinking about. How do the Victorian ghost stories connect with travel writing in their representations of place, travel, and history? And I'm always trying to encourage other readers and students to look more carefully at Victorian travel writing for its sort of Gothic potential. So Amelia Edwards, here she is wearing some fabulous outfit there. I love that collar. So she was a British writer who became one of the prominent Egyptologists of her era. She's sometimes referred to as the Queen of Egyptologists, which is nice. She was brought up in London, but then lived in Bristol for most of her adult life. And she had close relationships with women. She has been claimed as a queer icon. We know these identities are complicated in the 19th century. She certainly lived with women, including Ellen Drew Brasher, for 30 years. She had female travelling companion Lucy, and she was very close to women throughout her life. She never married. So she's an interesting figure on lots of levels. In 1872, after various other continental trips, she took a tour of the Dolomites, mountains in the southern Tyrol, followed by a walking tour of France. And then it was in 1873 to 4 that she conducted what became her famous tour of Egypt, the foundations for her best-selling travel text, 1,000 Miles Up the Nile. By this point, she was already a popular ghost story writer and novelist. I'm not going to say very much about her novels today. I haven't read many of those yet, but perhaps in the future. But she was known as a novelist before she kind of went into Egyptology. And then she became a co-founder of the Egypt Exploration Fund with Reginald Stuart Poole in 1882. She was interested in women's rights and was the vice president of the Society for Promoting Women's Suffrage. She was also interested in Egyptian women, as you can imagine, Egyptian queens, and she partly talked about those when she went on a long lecture tour towards the end of her life in the United States. So that's a little bit about her to give you the context. Let's have a think about some of her stories where you might have heard of her before. I know some people in the chat were already saying that they were familiar with the Phantom Coach, which is one of her frequently anthologized stories about a male narrator lost in the snow in the Scottish moors, trying to find his way home to his new wife, and then ends up getting into what becomes is discovered to be a phantom coach populated by some other dead passengers in a really kind of uncanny moment. So that's a really great story as a starting point for her work. And it was one of her collaborations with Charles Dickens. So you'll probably know that Charles Dickens was the editor of two very popular Victorian magazines, Household Words and All the Year Round, and that he collaborated with a lot of famous Victorian writers like Elizabeth Gaskell and Wilkie Collins, Sheridan Le Fanu, and invited them to write for his magazine, often in special Christmas editions. So some of Amelia's stories appeared in these special Christmas annuals. You can see that she also wrote for another Christmas annual, the Routledge's Christmas Annual for 1866, which is partly because her story that she'd written, the 4:15 Express, was deemed to be too long by Dickens, whereas the other annual were happy to take it. So this is a list of some of the stories that I'll come back to today, you know, by no means all of them. She didn't always write ghost stories. She also wrote early forms of crime fiction or weird stories. There are some modern editions of her writing, and this is a good one. There's also a Wordsworth classic one. Don't know if you can see that on Zoom, which is also good. So that they think about these supernatural or weird elements. There's not always a ghost in every story that she writes. Quite a lot of these stories are set outside the UK. They're set in Italy or Germany or France, Scotland, and they often include male narrators who are travellers themselves. Maybe they're engineers or barristers, kind of young professional men. They're rarely narrated by women, which is a sort of interesting way into thinking about the perspective that she's trying to give. So you may be familiar with Dickens's composite of short stories called Mugby Junction. I'm guessing that quite a few people might be familiar with The Signalman. Maybe write in the chat if that's something that you've heard of. A really, really fabulous story about a signalman and his pressures of making sure trains run on time and safely. And this was, as you can see here from the list of stories, all stories about trains, about railways, about travelling. And Amelia Edwards, who sometimes has that B, though, you know, not always. If you're giving her full name, she has that B for Blandford in her title. That makes it a little bit of a mouthful. She contributed a story called The Engineer, which was significant in this collection, about a train crash which is averted, though that the train crash is not averted in Dickens' own story, The Signalman. So that these kinds of narratives are very much engaging with what's sometimes referred to as railway mania, the kind of proliferation of the rail network across the UK from the 1840s onwards. So they're very sort of timely in what they're addressing, these kinds of stories that she gets involved with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trains now, trains and the Gothic, which I think is really interesting topic. I've put a couple of images here of how trains and train stations continue to haunt us. Some contemporary references. I don't know if you've seen this film about what you might see from trains or how you might be seen on a train. And then there's a Bengali image there, thinking about that sort of history of the hauntedness of trains, which you might want to look at. But let's have a look at this review that I found only yesterday. So I was very excited by this, from one of Edwards' short story collections called Monsieur Morris and Other Tales. So the reviewer is saying, you know, yeah, she's got a remarkable fondness for the supernatural. She describes a Jewish maiden who's died, who's been buried with Hebrew rites, who sits persistently on her tomb until she finds a gentleman who will have Christian prayers read and carve a cross thereon. This is the story of Salome, which I'll mention in a minute. The reviewer says, we should hope the eternal silence is not to be broken for such trifles. But then the reviewer gets really angry. The climax is reached when on 2 occasions we find a ghost in an express train. Really, we must protest against this. A ghost has its uses in an old castle or a deserted manor house. He may clank his chains in a highly picturesque manner. But a spectre, unappalled by the screeching of the express train, seating himself in a first-class carriage is too much. I love this kind of language there about how, you know, being on a train, the noise, the speed, is something that doesn't seem to fit with ideas of the Gothic or the ghost story, or what we might expect from a supernatural narrative. The reviewer still doesn't like the idea of a female ghost coming back from the dead to ask for her tomb to be changed. And those are 2 aspects of the stories that I find really, really fascinating. I also came across this, which made me smile, that even a couple of years ago in our contemporary magazine called the Railway Magazine, which I'm sure that you all subscribe to, that Amelia's stories were being reprinted. So the 4:15 Express is being described here as a Christmas railway ghost story. What a great combination of elements. And this is one of her key stories in this genre that I really recommend to you. So a bit of a spoiler here, but I guess you can see where this is going. On an afternoon before Christmas, a man finds himself sharing a train compartment with a man whom he later learns has been missing for 3 months. So clearly this other man is a ghost, he's not alive, but throughout the story, this is not apparent. The 2 men have a long conversation about their work, and about the pressures of Victorian masculinities. They're trapped in a carriage together for the duration of this journey, and that Edwards is really working with that idea of the train carriage as a particular kind of new Gothic space for Victorian writers. I find that really sort of interesting, and it was clearly something that she's also using in stories like the phantom coach, and also in the engineer, that idea about being in that travelling space alongside a mix of people whose stories may be shared with you. There's a lot of Victorian stories set on trains, not all of which are Gothic, but they all seem to have that kind of uncanny edge to them. You might not be sure where they're going. We can think about this certainly as a subgenre. You can see from the title of this recent anthology of stories, Uncanny Tales of the Railways, in the British Library Tales of the Weird, which is a fantastic series of anthologies. I imagine quite a few of you know about this, but if not, you have got, many happy hours ahead trying to decide which ones you're allowed to buy. That they put together great stories from 19th, 20th to the modern age, bringing together these sort of thematic resonances. So Edwards is contributing to this subgenre where the new railways were seen as both uncanny and dangerous, literally dangerous. I've mentioned that it's a kind of Gothic where strangers are brought together in a confined space, which can generate kind of tensions or narratives to come out, lost histories to be recovered, and that the stories are addressing these fears of modernity, certainly from in the second half of the 19th century. Bridget Marshall talks about this in her essay on industrialization and Victorian haunting, that alongside industrial progress, technological progress, looking to the future, there's always this uncanny edge, there's always casualties. It has particular effects on those of all different kinds of identities. There's a whole subgenre about women travelling on trains, which I won't sort of talk about today. You may know in relation to Charles Dickens as well, that he himself was involved in a train crash in 1865 in Staplehurst in Kent. This has contributed to his writing of The Signalman, where 14 people died in a derailment, and he was involved in trying to rescue people. He could see the aftermath of the crash, and registered that as a traumatic memory. There are these sort of traumatic scenes in Victorian fiction of train crashes, carriage crashes, deaths that affect families and relationships, and that then sort of generate these new responses to modernity. And I think that is something that sort of goes forward into new forms of crime and horror in the 20th and 21st centuries. Agatha Christie, who seems to be sort of haunting the edges of this talk, because I kept noticing resemblances to her. She has a great crime novel called The 450 from Paddington, where someone on one train sees something on another train, and then that's becomes part of the crime narrative, the mystery, that sort of clashing of different worlds. So think about trains as you're looking at Edwards' writing about different forms of travel. I'll move on to make a couple of points about Italy and about her crime writing and death spaces before we get on to looking at dark tourism. So in my research, I have been really interested in how women writers in particular approach Italy in the 19th century, which is a contested period in its history, the period of moving towards unification. Another writer of this time called Vernon Lee, who wrote a collection called Hauntings, and she lived in Italy, though she was a continental figure. She very much writes about Italy as a dark space, shadowed by history, obsessed with death. And I think Amelia Edwards sort of shares in that dynamic. She looks at Italy in very similar ways. And her story, the story of Salome, which is not always included in every anthology, is a really, really fabulous one. The one that I've mentioned previously about the Jewish female ghost returning to the site of her burial, to ask that she be memorialized in relation to Christian rites, which she was unable to tell her sort of domineering father. But there's a really key scene here set in the Jewish cemetery in Venice, the Ghetto of the Dead, which is seen as a space of desolation and waste. And the male narrator here is wandering through the cemetery. It's a story about two men's rivalry over this beautiful Jewish woman who runs a shop in Venice with her father, but then dies unexpectedly. And the obsession in the story is with the place of death, the place of burial. And I think you can see sort of remnants in here of Edwards' fascination with Egypt. She talks about the headstones being shattered, crusted over, eaten away, matted with weeds and brambles. And then she says they're half buried in the drifting sand. The headstones were all more or less broken or effaced. It's really similar language to how she describes Egypt in her travel writing. Being half buried in the sand, she literally uses that language. Half buried is one of her favourite words, it seems, sort of half below the surface. And she even describes the cemetery as a desert. So she's within her ghost story using her sort of skills as a place writer to set up this uncanny place, an uncanny setting, which draws on Italian history, the history of Jews within Venice, whether they are marginalized or not. You know, this is all something the story addresses. And then the narrator here meets what at this point he doesn't know is the ghost of a lady in deepest mourning by a recent grave. And it's only as the narrative unfolds that he realizes that she's mourning herself. So she's also in the story described as a woman in black, and she's prefiguring clearly, you know, Susan Hill's figure of the woman in black who also haunts the graveyard and wants her story to be told. So I find that a really fascinating aspect of this story. This is one that I really recommend. Another one set in Italy, this time in Rome, is the tragedy in the Palazzo Bardello, which I don't think is a real place because I've been trying to look it up, though there are palazzos with similar names. Often these Italian stories are very much set in real places, people walking down real streets, looking at real churches. So there isn't a ghost in this story, there is a death of the narrator's wife and of a small boy, but I'm not going to tell you anything else because that would ruin this story if you wanted to go and look it up. But I find this interesting because it's showing the intersection between crime fiction and the ghost story, which is another dominant trend of the later 19th century. You know, links to Arthur Conan Doyle, as you can imagine, his crime fiction, often quite ghostly and uncanny. But these stories are really interesting in terms of not just the crime and what has happened and the body, but how the Italian space is figured. The passage that I've put on the screen here is the narrator at the beginning of the story buying a present for his wife on his walk through the middle of Rome, and that he typically goes into a shop after looking through the window with the air of a purchaser, you know, looking at all these beautiful objects in the shops, and then goes into one of devotional articles before he chooses to buy a decorative crucifix for his Catholic wife. But this is within a shop in a huge mass of objects that are all described in great detail, including wreaths of immortelles, which are flowers or decorations which were put on graves. And later on in the story, he will be contemplating the immortelles on his wife's grave as he's mourning her and trying to find her killer. So this seems to be a typical scenario also in Edwards' writing. There are a lot of shops and a lot of objects within those shops, so that shop space itself becomes kind of uncanny or a kind of prefiguring death or danger, which again is very much part of the sort of developing commercial culture, perhaps, of the long 19th century. And objects are just super important, I think, to understanding Edwards' writing. Critics of the ghost story often talk about the haunted object as being something that certain writers fixate on. And clearly it's something that Edwards herself, as an Egyptologist, is likely to do. She was obsessed with objects. So her stories have often got these long descriptions, huge details. If they go to anyone's house, they're always shown into a room which is full of the most bizarre objects that have been collected. There's a room like this in the Phantom Coach, if you can recall this, a male collector in like a desolate, remote house who's got a whole room full of scientific objects and maps and bizarre things which acquire their own spectrality. But there's often a lot of exotic objects in Edwards' stories, and that word exotic is needs to be perhaps in scare quotes, objects that are being exoticized within the orientalizing culture of the 19th century, objects that have been collected from around the world and brought to a different space. So they're sort of haunted in terms of what this critic calls material diaspora and their foreignness. So Han Ying Lu talks about the diasporic as an insurmountable historical past that constantly emerges, threatening to return. So the object kind of brings this past into the home or the museum or a display place, into the cemetery, threatening from the past, threatening from elsewhere in the globe. And that image there is an image from Freud's desk, from the Freud Museum in London, which I recently visited. He was also, almost a contemporary of Edwards, a little bit later, but he was an avid collector of Egyptian antiquities, as she also was, and used those to inspire his writing, which is a whole other story. So this is sort of leading us into thinking about Egypt and how we could connect Edwards' writing and thinking to dark tourism. So wherever you are in the world, you've maybe seen collections of these very Egyptian antiquities that I'm talking about in a museum. There's a museum in Manchester, the Manchester Museum, just down the road from the university. There is lots of collections in the British Museum in London, also in Cairo, in their collections. And this is a really fascinating subject in itself in terms of the Gothic, about how Egypt and the Sudan are represented to the public, how those lost histories are described. From the website for the Manchester Museum, we're told how some of the 18,000 objects from Egypt and Sudan were acquired in the late 19th century, just after the period where Edwards herself had travelled there, funded by a local cotton merchant, Jessie Howarth, very much bound into these narratives of colonialism about who decided which objects were transferred to another country, how their stories were represented. And this is a really ongoing story, as I'm sure you'll know, how these uncanny objects, these objects representing death, mummies, sphinxes, grave goods, how they were represented to the public is something that sort of feeds into what Edwards is writing about. There's an interview about her from the 19th century where she talks about having Egyptian objects in her house, in her cupboards, including kind of hands and mummies, heads. So quite macabre, but part of what she wanted to write about. Some of you may have attended a talk by Jay Sullivan a few weeks ago, which I listened to on Catch Up on YouTube, which I found really fascinating, where she talked about Egyptian Gothic, or what she sometimes refers to as Egyptianized Gothic, so not written by Egyptians, but about Egypt, often by European writers, and Edwards' work could certainly fit into this kind of category. So she locates it within this period, 1884 to 1920. Edwards is writing before that, but she had produced this best-selling text, which I would think influenced some of these writers. But within the 19th century, people were showing their fascination for Egypt. They were attending what were referred to as mummy unwrappings in halls or universities or museums. Egyptian objects were gradually being acquired throughout this period, and tourist industry was booming. So Thomas Cook launches his Egyptian tours in 1869, very much at the time that Amelia Edwards herself is traveling down the Nile. She talks about the Cook tourists traveling alongside her. And we have what's sometimes described as Egyptomania in this transitional period. This fascination also with the magic, the supernatural, the esoteric that Egyptian culture offers, the fascination with the old world and the ancient. But this is all at a time of instability for the British Empire, for colonialism. So lots of the stories, the travel writing that's produced at the time is sometimes sort of self-reflective about how it's engaging with the colonial moment, how Egypt itself and Egyptians and Egyptian history are being represented, are all part of the story. And this is a kind of ongoing story. Another snippet here from contemporary edition of the Museum's Journal, asking if visitors still wanted to see the body of an Egyptian woman displayed, which is a whole debate about how human remains should be displayed in museums, which has led to a sort of questioning of museum practice around death. But we can see those debates also going on in the time of the Victorians. So let's have a think about how 1,000 Miles Up the Nile specifically engages with some of these ideas. If we're thinking about what dark tourism might represent, it might be a sort of term that you're unfamiliar with. The darkness that is added is often used to relate to, like visits to Ground Zero, to Auschwitz, a site of death and violence, genocide. Some people think, why would you want to visit those places? Why would anyone go? That's so morbid and disturbing. But now there's sort of critical debates about this darkness of dark tourism, and I don't think it's just something that relates to post-modernity. We can see this darkness in the 19th century too, visiting death sites or the sites of the Ripper murders, for example, or touring around that. You can see the beginnings of that in this period. Philip Stone is one of the key voices who talks about dark tourism, about how tourists gather these meanings about mortality from visiting a site, which can lead to a reconceptualization of death, which might not have been what they were imagining when they visited a dark site. So I'm trying to sort of use some of these ideas, some of which are from tourism studies, sociology, to sort of enrich how we might understand Edwards' writing. I think we can look at her travel writing in terms of some of these other dominant narratives, like the idea of the cursed mummy, the idea that mummy narratives can wreak evil on the usually male archaeologist is one you may have heard before, used in stories by Conan Doyle, Arthur Christie, Agatha Christie, not Arthur Christie. That would be an interesting mashup of authors. They also used by Bram Stoker in The Jewel of Seven Stars. And this idea that tourism is inseparable from commercialism, as we know, but something that's very much addressed in Victorian writing, I think. Financial exchange is threaded through Edwards' narratives. She also talks about herself in this kind of language, about reflecting on her visits to death sites. She travelled for about 6 months from Cairo up the Nile to the Second Cataract and back, visiting tombs and temples, and digging, buying from Egyptian locals as she was doing this. But she uses this language about grubbing for treasure, about raiding the sites, worried about her sort of presence in this domain. And this is a sort of interesting passage in this respect, I think. This is a scene where she's traveling quite early on, I think, in her journey. She's still adjusting to being in Egypt, and they're on a site, standing on bones, picking up little bits, fragments, but then realise that they're actually in a graveyard, that they're actually standing in the sand on violated graves, which have been raided by people before them. Always this narrative of raiding that fits into her travelling. But she says, we soon became quite hardened to such sights and learned to rummage among dusty sepulchres with no more compunction than would have befitted a gang of professional body snatchers, people who steal from graves. She said that it was infectious, this passion for relic hunting, that most Egyptian travellers would confess to this. Shocked at first, they denounced with horror the whole system of sepulchral excavation. Acquiring, however, a taste for scarabs and funerary statuettes, they soon begin to buy with eagerness the spoils of the dead. Finally, they asked no better fortune than to discover and confiscate a tomb for themselves. So she's sort of talking a little bit in terms of us and them. Maybe this is not all her, even though she locates herself in being hardened to such sights, but she's acknowledging that sort of horror is bound up with this passion for relics, that buying the spoils of the dead is problematic, but that people are all going to be caught up in this practice. And I find this just really fascinating. 1,000 Miles Up the Nile is a super long book, really, really long, like 550 pages. It's taken me a while, but there's really fascinating passages within this and quite sort of contradictory in some ways. There are some kind of racist, quite a lot of racist language that she uses in relation to the Egyptian and Arab people that she meets. But then there's also kind of real insights into sort of excavation and what the presence of the Europeans in this world of death, about how they should be behaving. Here's one of her images here, literally entitled Digging for Mummies, that she becomes involved almost by chance at some of the sites that she visits in this digging that is being going on, and sees these sort of new bodies being brought out. Roger Luckhurst talks about this in his really fantastic book, looking at kind of history around sort of tomb raising at the time. He talks about the sort of idea of the object again, the idea that objects are cursed. If a curse ensues when a dead body is taken, you know, by Egyptologists from its resting place, that the curse which ensues is maybe to do with this refusal of objects to obey subjects. The sort of back to that idea of the haunted object again. The mummy's curse manifests itself in stories at the end of the 19th century in terms of people bringing these objects into their homes and then, you know, wreaking death, destruction on their family, their loved ones. Things are moving around the house. So quite a sort of terrifying idea, really, sort of exuding strange smells, often this sort of smell of death from the object that's been exhumed. So all this sort of thinking about, particularly, I think, European and American sort of attitudes to Egypt at this time, in a period of colonial unrest, period just after the The Suez Canal is being created, where Egypt is right at the sort of centre of discussions about trade routes and who is sort of vying for power there. That very much feeds into travel writing and Gothic stories of this time. So it's just a sort of final example as I'm finishing up here, where you can see the kind of ghostliness of the way in which Edwards writes about Egypt at the time. She talks a lot about the darkness of visiting tomb spaces, but also the colossal statues of this ancient world. The statues of kings and queens are also represented as ghostly, and they're often visited at night or the twilight when it's cooler, as you can imagine. She's talking here about the colossi in Abbey Symbol, I think this is, that she looks at from her boat, but also from on foot. She says the 4 colossi came out, almost appearing ghostly, vague and shadowy in the enchanted moonlight. Even as we watch them, they seem to grow, to dilate, to be moving towards us out of the silvery distance. They're, dashing towards them. The painter and the writer herself is the writer. She refers to herself like that all the way through. They haven't got patience. They want to run towards these monuments and record them. And they're standing there at the feet of the colossi on the threshold of that vast portal beyond which was darkness. The great statues towered above their heads. There's a keen silence. It's very only the sounds of themselves there. Very much this Gothic language, this language of darkness, and often dark tourism is literally dark. There's a lot of really dark spaces, sometimes pitch black, that Edwards and her fellow travellers enter as they're getting to the tombs, either beneath the surface or within the rock, these subterranean spaces of death. They're not quite sure what they're looking for, and then this becomes apparent. Things are only lit up by candles as they're going through these dark spaces. So I think it's just trying to think about how we could use some of those ideas from dark tourism or discussions about haunted objects to think about how Edwards is looking at Egypt. Is something that I am particularly interested in at the moment. Who would not be terrified in the presence of these amazing monuments from thousands of years ago? You can see the small figures in the foreground there to give you an idea of the size, and that crumbling of the statues that are broken, fragmented, in ruins, very much part of this Gothic aesthetic. So that is the end of the talk, and I will leave that there for a moment if you want some recommendations about what you might want to read or watch next. But I'd also recommend that you head down to your local museum and have a look at your Egyptian collections, perhaps in a new light, or you could plan your next trip down the Nile. Okay, thank you for listening.